Hello, this is Kramer, your professor. I'm currently recording this lecture in my office in an empty building, ultimately. No, there's some people here. As I have children at home, I can't record these lectures there. This is a bit awkward. It's not ideal. There's a lot of questions I'm sure you'll have, given the number of questions that you all have had going up to this point. So this mode of presentation is not the best. I will pretend I'm standing in front of you, and I will try to anticipate any questions you might have. I'm looking at a picture of my son Milo, and right next to him is a bust of Socrates, so they will be my audience. So that's, if I pause and go off in a reverie thinking of my children, that's what's happened. In any case, I don't want to have these lectures be too long. I really have no idea how long it will be. I haven't really talked through this one. This lecture will be on cosmological arguments. I will have the slides posted, and the slides each have numbers, and I'll try and reference them as I go. It specifically is on St. Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways, and Leibniz's version of the cosmological argument in particular, his use of what we now call the principle, or what is called the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, if you see that throughout. That's in the background of just about every version of the cosmological argument. I'll try to keep up with the schedule as well, so Tuesday, Thursdays schedule, just to keep things consistent. So we'll have another lecture. I intend to probably do an audio lecture as well on the Kalam cosmological argument from William Lane Craig. A lot of what we'll cover today, or in this lecture, is useful background for that more contemporary argument. And what we covered last week on ontological arguments, some of the conceptual work that we did will be, you'll find, quite useful here. The readings you had today for this lecture were about 4 pages total, so I hope you've read them at least 7 times each. You now have the time to do so. But there's some complexities in each of them. There's a lot we could say about them. So let me just get right to it, and I'll start with Aquinas. There's a picture of Aquinas in the first slide. I don't recall how much background I gave last time. I talked about Aquinas, known as the dumb ox of Sicily. That was the nickname he was given, because he had a what we would consider akin to a southern accent in the United States. We have a bias, we have a prejudice against southern accents, equating that with being ignorant. That's itself a stupid stereotype, as it turns out. And people had that view of Aquinas. Of course, the people who called him the dumb ox of Sicily, they're lost to history. I don't know who they are, but we do know who St. Thomas Aquinas is, and he's incredibly influential. We'll see his use of the Greek philosophers, in particular Aristotle, whom we've mentioned, of course, before. Aquinas just refers to him as the philosopher in the readings, and everyone knew who he was talking about. You will see in Aquinas' first 3 ways, this is basically straight out of the pagan philosopher Aristotle. This is called a cosmological argument, as we'll see, as an attempt to explain everything, the cosmos, which in Greek, cosmos means order in general, but we're trying to figure out what's the origin of everything. Next slide shows Aquinas, a more accurate representation of him, because you can see here he's enormous. He was a giant of a man, which I do believe I mentioned that last time. In any case, he was a giant philosopher as well, which we're most interested in. I'm going to quickly go through, on slide 3, his epistemology, his theories of knowledge, because in the background of the cosmological argument is the presumption that we can use our natural reason to prove the existence of, for example, human free will, to investigate the existence of souls and the immortality of those souls. And of course, what is of interest to us today is the existence of God. For Aquinas, like Anselm before, the discipline of philosophy would be considered you might call it a handmaiden to theology. Of course, there's debates about this throughout the history of philosophy, going back to Plato. What is in service of what? For Aquinas and Anselm, and Augustine before them, the A-League philosophers, if you will. Theology is primary. Religion is primary. Belief, faith is primary. It's faith seeking understanding, as Anselm put it. Philosophy is a tool, an organon, as Aristotle would refer to it. Logic is a tool in the service of theology for Aquinas. And it can't be ignored. It can't be dismissed if there is a contradiction, for example, in one's argument, one's theological argument. Aquinas could not stand for this. Unless, of course, you're dealing with truths that are established by faith alone. Now that sounds like a bit of an out, or sort of an escape clause that Aquinas has access to. And that's a fair critique. I'm not going to get into that now, but you could imagine how someone might find it problematic that, some fundamental theological assumptions like the Trinity, incarnation, for example, these are shrouded in mystery and logic has no foothold. This is unappealing to many because it seems to be a conversation stopper, right? How do you explain the Trinity? Well, that's a mystery. We cannot explain logically. We cannot use the tools of philosophy to explain how God is homoousios versus homoiousios, to use the unnecessarily Greek term. Sorry, I'll skip that. Maybe I'll edit this later. I'm not going to do that. The incarnation, the idea that God can become flesh, incarnate, that again seems contradictory. How can there be a God that is fully human and fully divine? How could there be a being that possesses those features? Logic cannot answer that. After all, it fundamentally leads to a violation of law of contradiction, or non-contradiction, as Aristotle put it. So I'm going to again put aside the arguments for why that should be a matter of faith alone. And we'll return to that, however, later on. But this conception of what constitutes the realm, the magisteria of faith versus the magisteria of logic and reason, this is, again, one of those debates that seems interminable. One might ask, how does one cordon off these two areas? In other words, what tool do we use to establish this is a matter of faith and reason has nothing to say about it, versus this is a matter of reason and not faith, and faith is not necessary, and what is a matter of a combination of the two? If you look at people like John Locke, for example, to establish that something is a matter of faith alone, still, it seems, requires one's use of reason. It seems impossible to escape that. I have to make a decision. I have to make an argument and say, here's why this is a matter of faith and not of reason. And yet, of course, we have not escaped the clutches of reason. In any case, let us move on. What are some of the truths known by natural philosophy, natural reason? This, of course, is the conception. Move on to slide 4 here. That we can use natural reason. We can prove the existence of God without the need for reliance on some kind of divine spark or even revelation for that matter. Now, how is this done? It is not done the way that we saw with Anselm. Ontological arguments are interesting. They get at a conception of the divine that Aquinas is not going to disagree with. But Aquinas, like Immanuel Kant after him, sorry, I was pondering a Kant joke there. That's why I paused. But you know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. No, I have a good one too. It's a better one than I've ever actually come up with. But I'm going to show my willpower here, and not give you the Kant joke. Okay? You can think of your own and shout them at the computer screen now if you wish. Anyway, wish I hadn't said that, threw me off. Probably should edit this. Yes, ontological arguments. Aquinas does not think you can go from the definition, the conception of something, to an existential proposition about it. We don't go from knowledge claims. Let's say, I know this about this concept. I have an understanding a priori, which, of course, you recall means prior to experience. I have a conceptual understanding of what a triangle is. And once I understand the conceptual nature of a triangle, I don't need to go out into the world to experience a number of triangles to derive a conclusion about the attributes of such entities. This is a priori. This is an analytic truth that doesn't require a kind of move from experiencing things to its conclusion. But I cannot, of course, prove the existence of things like triangles, like bachelors, unmarried males of marrying age, and so on, without, of course, using experience. And Aquinas is going to be of the opinion that this is the case for everything. All our knowledge, he says, even of immaterial things, if you want numbers, triangles, and so on, must be derived from our perception of sensible things in some fashion. And in this way, he follows in the footsteps of Aristotle and the empirical nature of Aristotelian philosophy, that it's perception, it's sensible things. Of course, there are things that we cannot directly perceive, and he admits this, and he's aware of this. But the inferences that we make from our experiences to these otherwise, at least in theory, perceptible entities is what is required. And I think contemporary theoretical physics would be an example of this, where we do not have empirical access to all sorts of things that we claim to exist, say in quantum mechanics. Yet it would be somewhat counterintuitive to discount to discount quantum mechanics on that basis, that we cannot directly perceive quarks and gluons and so on. We can make inferences based upon that. That's one of the most well-established sciences of the day. In fact, the machines that we're using right now rely upon such computing capacity. All right, so that's some of the background. I'm going to get right into the argument on slide 6. The question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Which seems like a silly question, or maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe I'm begging the question by saying that. It's a great question. Let me back up. And there's an astrophysicist, I believe he's an astrophysicist, a guy named Lawrence Krauss. I have a picture of his book, came out somewhat recently. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's a philosophical question going back to ancient philosophers, of course, ancient Greek philosophers. And as a physicist, cosmologist, studier of the cosmos, Lawrence Krauss has a physics-based answer. And not surprisingly, it's based on Big Bang hypotheses, which we'll return to in more detail with the Kalam cosmological arguments next time. But his A Universe from Nothing, the title says quite a bit. And his conception of nothing, of course, if some of you are familiar with this book, is very different than Aquinas', for example, very different than Anselm's, very different than philosophers and theologians. Krauss, by the way, has had a somewhat publicly negative view of philosophers, in particular philosophers of science, along with Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Hawking, and others, which I find somewhat problematic. I'm not going to get into that, tirade now, because it angers me. But Krauss is theorizing about the origins of everything. If this is not itself a philosophical question, then I really do not know what is. So he's engaging in philosophy. It's just that he may be failing in some conceptual analyses. And we'll see whether, again, a little bit of this will be introduced today with Aquinas, but we'll see with the Kalam cosmological argument with William Lane Craig next time, and what exactly nothing is. For Krauss, nothing is not the absence of anything. It's basically, he would talk about a kind of field from which the universe comes, which is itself already, that's fascinating, and the scientific data that may support that hypothesis, I'm not going to discount. and it's a brilliant text, and it gets at how we could move from whatever physicists refer to as this kind of field that's very different than the universe that we see today. How everything emerges from that is fascinating. But it's just simply not nothing. That's not the conception that Aquinas has. Nothing means no space, no time, no container to hold something. Nothingness isn't simply a container that is empty. There is no container. There is no time, there is no space, there is no thing. That is nothing from the perspective of the theological philosophers. And why, we might ask, are there any things at all? Why are there contingent things? And we've already spoken about what contingent means in our distinction between necessary, contingent, and possible entities when we discuss the modal arguments, the modal ontological arguments. I'll say more about contingent as it relates to this argument today. But why are there these particular contingent things is yet another question that cries out for an explanation. Not just why is there anything at all, but why are there the particular things that there are? Why are we here? Why am I individually here? I ask myself as I look out into the rain. The weather is just perfect for what's going on in the world right now. It's just raining horribly in Santa Barbara. Why is that? Sorry, I was just drinking some tea there. As far as you know, that was tea. Why do the particular contingent things that do exist, why do they exist now rather than at some other time? Right? I mean, I exist now. I could have existed during the Civil War, or Revolutionary War, or during the year 2. I could have been born in the year 2. I don't even know what was happening then. So there's a Louis C.K. bit there I was going to move into. But I wasn't, right? I was born in this generation, and here I am, and I'm not sure. I guess I can explain that through my parents. But they didn't choose me in particular, and their parents before them, and so on. And of course, the ultimate question that Aquinas is asking, why this particular contingent stuff was brought about, and by what? That's the fundamental question. Now, to get to the argument, I'm sorry for the introductory comments, let's move into it. On slide 7, we have what are known as presuppositions. I don't want to say they're totally unargued for, but they're part of the background. You only had a couple of pages from Aquinas, so there wasn't the space for him to provide. He didn't provide arguments for each of these claims, but we can do so. And some of them just seem straightforwardly obvious. All effects have causes. For every effect, there is a cause. This seems non-controversial. Even if we take it to the level of the quantum physics, there may be a kind of randomness or indeterminacy, which is different than saying something happens without any cause whatsoever. I'm not going to get into that dispute now. We will take, for the sake of argument, that the claim is true. All effects have causes. In addition, the second presupposition, all causes precede their effects. Now, David Hume has some interesting things to speak about with simultaneous causation. And that's a complex idea, which I don't think it will become relevant perhaps when we look at the Kalam thought experiment, the Kalam cosmological argument. But you can think of something happening, and then the moment it happens, it has a causal efficacy, causal power on something other than itself. However, it seems odd to speak of that as truly simultaneous. It could just appear to be simultaneous. In fact, that's more likely the case from our perspective. Our lack of proper instruments to measure the time distance, so to speak, between these two particular things that are causally connected make it appear that they happen at the same time. When lightning and thunder happen at the same time, it appears there's a causal relation that's immediate between those two, and that they happen at the same time simultaneously. Of course, unless you're distant from it, you can kind of tell that there is a time lag between the two. Now, all causes precede, they come before their effects. This would be very strange if it weren't the case. We have something happen, and then we look back. What was the causal connection to that? To talk of causes happening after their effects, for the most part, there may be some logical causal relations that are unique. It could be the case that my son or my daughter have children in the future. So in the future, they may cause me to become a grandfather, and we could say I, in the future, will become a grandfather, and there's some causal thing in the future that will have some connection. But of course, you wouldn't speak of me being a grandfather until after they've... I don't want to talk about that anymore. They're too small to be talking about making me a grandfather. In any case, all causes precede their effects. Let's just establish that is... there are ways of arguing about it, but we're going to assume that that's true. The third one, again, this seems obvious. Nothing can be self-caused. To be self-caused implies I bring myself into being. This is a logical impossibility. And as we recall from Aquinas' discussion of omnipotence and the paradox of the stone, we recall Aquinas was not open to the idea, to the possibility that omnipotence should include the capacity to do that which is logically impossible, which would include, being able to create a rock so big that God cannot lift it. Well, no, God can't do that, but so what? Nothing can. That's logically impossible. Even an omnipotent being cannot do that which is logically impossible. That means even an omnipotent being cannot cause itself to be. That is essential. The explanation or purpose or reason for God's being or existence may be self-contained. That's different than that God created God's self, because to create something implies there was a time in which it was not. I create a poem. Prior to creating it, prior to thinking about it, it does not exist. I create a bench. I build a bench. I make it. There was a time in which that bench was not. There was a time in which I was not. I could not bring myself into being, because logically that would imply I would have to exist as the cause of me. So I would be both cause and effect at the same time. This is logically impossible. So that sounds straightforward. First three are very few problems to them, I think. The fourth one, here's where we get into the meat of the matter. An infinite regress of causes is what the modern philosophers would refer to as repugnant. It is logically impossible. It is absurd. You cannot have an infinite regress of causes. And there's a number of reasons for this, and we'll talk about it again with Leibniz and his conception of the principle of sufficient reason, which is already inchoate, if I may, already embedded within some of the philosophy of the pagan Aristotle and his first cause arguments, which are relying on some version of this. An infinite regress of causes is impossible. We have to have something that stops that regress. I'll expand on this with the specific arguments. 5. I think this is probably the most interesting part of Aquinas' argument. It's basically his third way of the 5. If all that exists in the universe are merely contingent things, that is, including the universe itself, well, then there must have been a time in which there was nothing. Nothing at all. We start to see why the question, why is there something rather than nothing, that becomes all the more important for us. If all that ever existed were contingent things, like you and me, remember, you're not necessary. You are contingent, which means, in part, there was a time in which you did not exist. If this is true of everything, like trees, planets, your parents, I don't know why I put your parents after planets, the sun, the galaxy. There was a time in which our galaxy did not exist. Some, 8 billion years ago. I'm not anyone taking astronomy can answer that question. Our Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. That means before then, there was no Earth. Our universe has been around 14 billion years. The presumption is prior to that, it was not. So if you go back, well, you can't go back 15 billion years, because time and space began, presumably, during the Big Bang or after the Big Bang. The hypothesis there is that there was nothing, remember. Absolutely nothing. There was no time, there was no space, there was no container, there was nothing. And if that's the case, and if you look at presupposition number 6, it is impossible to get something from nothing. To assume you could is to violate, again, Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, or Aquinas' version of that. To get something from nothing violates this principle. You have no explanation. Where did this come from? Nothing. This is no explanation. So, if you can get nothing, if you cannot get something from nothing, oh good Lord, let me just read it. It is impossible to get something from nothing, if that's true. And if number 5 is true, that all that exist are contingent things, and there must have been a time in which there was nothing. Well, then those two combined with the first 4 presuppositions lead to the conclusion that there must have always been something. And that something that has always been, of course, can't itself be another contingent thing, lest we fall into the infinite regress. There must be something that stops that infinite regress. That, of course, for Aquinas, going back to Aristotle, is God. The first cause, the uncaused cause, the first mover, the prime mover, as Aristotle will put it, the necessary being, that which cannot not exist, to make things unnecessarily confusing. With these presuppositions in hand, we can go to the next slide. We see Aquinas' 5 ways. Why didn't I number? Okay. Motion, efficient causation, possibility, and necessity. The gradation found in things, as he puts it, and design. I'm not going to talk about the 5th way today in any more detail than just to mention it's also called the teleological argument, which is telos, Greek for ends or purposes or function. We look at the world and we see that it has a function, a design implied in it. We look at a computer, we see it has function, order, complexity, and we know it was made by a designer, and the universe itself is analogous in some ways to this. It probably also has a designer. I'll talk more about that when we get to design arguments after the break. But we already went through the first 3, and the 4th one I'm going to just spend very little time on. But the way of motion, Aquinas tells us, we see things empirically, a posteriori. We reason from experience. We see things in motion. These things in motion did not bring themselves to move. They have causes prior to them. So 1 and 2 go together. He uses efficient causation for number 2. That's borrowing from Aristotle's, one of his conceptions of cause. Famously, Aristotle has 4 notions of cause, which we will not concern ourselves with at the moment. But efficient causation is basically the kind of causation we use typically today. One thing causes another either to move, or in this case, to be. It brings it into existence. So if we see an object moving, I'll use later on railway cars as an example. We see this railway car moving. Well, if it's not hooked up to an engine, what is moving it? It must be the railway car before it. And what's moving that railway car that moved the first? And so on. We cannot have an infinite regress of one thing moving another without having an engine, so to speak. So, an infinite regress is repugnant. We must have an explanation for the motion that we do see. We do perceive it. I think the more compelling argument is the causation one, part 2, the second way. We do see things existing. And, as we'll see with number 3, possibility and necessity, or contingency and necessity. Remember the distinction between those 2 terms, possibility and contingency. We do see things come into existence, and then go out of existence, right? Something else, something other than those things themselves, brought them to be. You came into existence some, 18, 20, 25 years ago. I don't know how old you all are. 30 years ago for me. And you will go out of existence again, but, not for a really long time. your existence is contingent upon something other than yourself. And then that takes us to the third way, which I think is as I said, the crux of his argument here, possibility and necessity. I prefer contingency and necessity for the reasons we discussed before. All contingent beings are possible, but remember, you could be a necessary being, and of course, if you're necessary, you're also obviously possible. But if you look around the world, and we see all these things coming into existence that weren't there before, we see that something brought them into existence. This tree that I'm looking out in the window here wasn't always there. I don't know, 50 years ago it was a seed, and that seed caused it to be, and that seed came from somewhere else. Where did that seed come from? Perhaps another tree, and this goes on, but there cannot be an infinite regress of this. These trees, these things, these objects come into being by something other than themselves. And now, if it's true of everything, this is the central part of the argument, and I'll return to it somewhat redundantly later on, because I think it's the crux of it. If all that exists are merely contingent things, that means, of course, a contingent thing, importantly here, is something that exists now but doesn't have to exist. There was a time in which it did not exist. This is true of our planet. Therefore, it's true of everything in our planet. It's true of our galaxy. It's contingent. It's true of our universe itself. If the universe is contingent, that means there was a time in which it was not. And if there was a time in which, and that language is already confused, if there is nothing, if there was nothing, then there would always be nothing. Because you cannot get something from nothing. And if you cannot get something from nothing, and if there was nothingness, there would always be nothingness. This reductio ad absurdum, reduce to absurdity, to assume that there is no necessary being, is revealed here. Clearly, it's absurd to think there is no necessary being. Because look, you exist. If you want to be an extreme skeptic, you can at least still invoke your own existence. You exist. And your existence is contingent upon something else. You are something. And if you're not necessary, but you're something. How about that? If you exist, then God exists. I mean, that's a really short, in fact, way too short way of putting it. But you can see why that might be for Aquinas. And he fills in these other blanks. Again, if the universe were contingent, which of course we think it is, because even Stephen Hawking, an atheist, says time and space came into being 14-point-something billion years ago. That means prior to that, there was nothing. And if there was nothing, and Aquinas is correct, you can't get something from nothing, there would still be nothing. But of course that presumption is absurd, because again, you exist, trees exist, and so on. Therefore there must be, and have always been, a necessary being, which halts that infinite regress. It explains how there is motion. It explains how there are any things at all. And it is a necessary being that cannot not exist. It is a being that has always been. You can say it, in other words, there was never a time in which this being was not. Now, that being is Aristotle's God, and it is not the God, so far, of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so on. The fourth and fifth ways are necessary to get a sense of filling in the features, because from a necessary being, it's not obvious that we then derive omnipotence, omniscience, much less omnibenevolence. Those have to be figured in with external arguments outside of this, I think. Although cases have been made to try to go from a necessary being to all the omnis God. Now the fourth way kind of does this when it looks at the gradation found in things. Now Aquinas basically says the universe is ordered And you can think of it in terms of a spectrum from the least to the greatest, if you want. There's a taxonomy we could use from zoology up to astrophysics, from microbiology to studies of heavenly bodies. And so we have these, Aquinas wouldn't have been aware of this, but you can think of single-celled organisms. And then we also have humans and everything in between, this plenum, as it's sometimes referred to, or this great chain of being. The American philosopher Arthur Lovejoy calls it, where there is no break. You've got single-celled organisms, then you've got multicellular organisms, and you go seemingly up this chain of greater being. Greater in the sense of, more of it and better. And there's a progression Aquinas sees. And if he were alive today, I think he would see, this proves my point. Look at all of these, look at all the degrees we know about in biology and zoology and so forth. And surely the single-celled organism is not as great as the lizard. And the lizard is not as great as the cat or the dog or whatever. And the dog, and here you get into complexities, of course, and confusions, but at least in increasing of being and existence and consciousness and goodness, so forth, you get dolphins, you get porpoises, elephants, primates with the capacity to for language, the capacity to think abstractly, and so on. And then you get eventually to humans. And Aquinas adds, there's not just humans, there are beings, entities greater than humans. He calls them angels. Spiritual beings, incorporeal, lacking bodies. These are greater, and the arguments for that, of course, I'm not going to get into now. If there is a greater than, Aquinas tells us, there must be a greatest. We see versions of this argument all the way back to Plato. If something is hotter than another, there must be a hottest. If something is better than another, there must be a best, and so on. Now, there are some obvious problems with this reasoning. We can think of the number series, for instance, and say, look, if 2 is greater than 1, then there must be a greatest. And I don't know what that greatest number would be. We'll talk more about numbers later, but that's a potential refutation for this. But you kind of see where he's going. If this Mother Teresa is better than Hitler, then there must be a best. He says there must be the ultimate from which we can judge as a kind of standard all the others. We'll return to that viewpoint when we look at Linda Zagzesby's, I think is how you say it, her argument for the existence of God based on moral reasoning. The idea that there has to be, if there's morality at all, objective morality, there has to be an absolute that grounds it. And she does think there is objective morality, therefore there needs to be this absolute. Very Platonic argument we see here with Aquinas. And then the design argument, as I said, I'll return to when we look at Paley and we look at Collins and other contemporary fine-tuning arguments, as they're sometimes referred to. All right, so if you look then going forward here, we've got a version of the cosmological argument on slide 9. I've basically given you the argument. This is the argument, however, in standard logical form. Premise 1, some things are caused. They depend upon a cause other than itself or themselves. We recall from the presuppositions, premise 2, nothing can be the cause of itself. Therefore, everything that is caused, is caused by something other than itself. Premise 4 tells us you can't have a causal chain that stretches infinitely backward in time. That's repugnant, that's logically impossible, and it violates, as we're going to see again, the principle of sufficient reason. If the causal chain cannot stretch infinitely backward in time, then there must be a first cause. This cause itself cannot be contingent because then it would need to be explained by something other than itself. And the infinite regress continues. Premise 7, and here's where you might find take pause if you want. Only God could qualify as a necessary or non-contingent being. Therefore, our 8th line, God exists as that necessary being. We'll look again at this with the Kalam cosmological argument and William Lane Craig's I almost said Daniel Craig. William Lane Craig's argument that that first cause can't be a contingent physical thing, because then it requires a kind of explanation. It requires itself an explanation. And it can't be anything other than what we would consider mental, a mind that has causal powers. That's the only thing that qualifies. And the only mental being capable of such causal powers, the assumption is that it is a divine being. On slide 10, I've got an alternate version of this cosmological argument. I think it's actually clearer. It's from a philosopher named Bruce Reichenbach. I'll just go through it fairly quickly here. Premise 1, a contingent being, that is a being such that if it exists, right, it could have not existed, or could cease to exist, right? Such a thing exists, like you and me, we do exist. That's an easy premise to accept. 2, this contingent being has a cause for explanation for its existence. Premise 3, the cause of or explanation for its existence is something other than the contingent being itself. It's helpful to sometimes get different versions of the argument, I think, to clarify things, as we did with the ontological argument before. This is the fourth premise. What causes or explains the existence of this contingent being must either be solely other contingent beings, which we can do up to a point, or a non-contingent necessary being. Premise 5, contingent beings alone cannot provide a completely adequate causal account or explanation for the existence of a contingent being. There's going to be a point at which we run out of explanations. 6, therefore, what causes or explains the existence of this contingent being must include a non-contingent or necessary being. Therefore, 7, a necessary being exists. The universe itself, as we've already discussed, is contingent. Therefore, the necessary being is something other than the universe. Now, notice Reichenbach's argument here. This does not yet give us, obviously, the God of Christianity, for example. It doesn't obviously give us that God. If it works, it gives us a necessary being. And what we can deduce from that is going to vary, and you're going to see the arguments, especially when we get into the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. A contemporary of Leibniz's, far after Aquinas, gives a version of this that's also, I think, helpful to expand on this. This is Samuel Clarke, where he says, this is slide 11, premise 1, every being that exists or ever did exist is either dependent, a dependent being, or a self-existent being. And the language there is paralleling contingent and necessary. Self-existent doesn't mean self-caused. It means necessary in this case. Premise 2, not every being can be a dependent being, for some of the reasons we've looked at already. Conclusion, therefore there exists a self-existent being. All of these versions, this is kind of like an equivalent of the Cartesian two-premise argument for the ontological argument. It clarifies things, but of course premise 2 needs to be filled in. And each of these versions of Samuel Clarke's version, Aquinas' version, Reichenbach's version of the cosmological argument relies upon a basic logical philosophical principle. And it's what Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, slide 12, pictured there. That's what he looks like. And he always looked like that. I assume he took his hair off on occasion, because it looks very uncomfortable. But Leibniz, the polymath, introduces in a formal way this principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz, you're probably familiar with him from your math classes. Incredibly influential in just about every field of philosophy. We see him in possible worlds we already discussed, and we'll see again when we look at the theodicies. Those are arguments to attempt to justify the goodness of God in the face of evil. Epistemology, logic, metaphysics, of course, philosophy of religion, all of this. He had political philosophy as well. There he is again on slide 13. His hair is really curly there. He's done a lot of work on that wig. The principle of sufficient reason. You are familiar with it. You've even said things like, everything happens for a reason. You might be saying that right now about why everything is shutting down across the world. Everything happens for a reason. Consider how and when you say that. To add to the concept here, there are no adequate theory or explanation can contain any brute or crude or unexplained facts. What he means by that, in theory, everything, every positive fact and every negative fact, if you want to speak of things that don't exist, has a reason and explanation. Why don't unicorns exist? No reason. That would be a weird way of speaking. You may not know why unicorns don't exist. That's very different than saying there is no causal, explanatory, rational explanation. He says further, does Leibniz, this principle must be considered, quote, must be considered one of the greatest and most fruitful of all human knowledge, for upon it is built a great part of metaphysics, physics, and moral science, end quote. So this is pretty foundational, and it is essential to, I think, every version of the cosmological argument in some way. It needs to be cashed out. So on slide 14, to expand on what this principle is. Principle of sufficient reason, PSR. Premise 1. Every member of a collection of dependent beings has a cause or an explanation. Every member, every individual, every part of that whole. Premise 2. Therefore, the collection of dependent being has a cause or explanation. So that immediate inference, trying to explain what the principle of sufficient reason is doing in the background. To add to it, we say, there must be an explanation of the existence of any being and of any positive fact, the series of individual beings, whatever. An example that's oftentimes used, you've got a collection of stamps, and I can explain the individual stamps, for example. Let's say I'm a philatelist, which is a term I hope you'll look up. Philatelist, it's someone who collects stamps. And I have all these individual stamps, thousands of them, and I explain each one individually. We might ask, have I explained my collection? Has the explanation of each individual stamp satisfied my curiosity about the entire series? Can I explain a whole collection of things by way of, and only by way of, explaining the individual parts? Here is another sticking point in this argument where there's going to be disagreement. And later there's a video, which I'm not going to play, but you will have access to it, or it's actually audio, of a debate between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston on this very issue. It's only like 15 minutes. But they debate over whether or not one can make the move from satisfactorily explaining a series of events or a collection of something by way of simply looking at the individual parts. Must we then expand and say, all right, what's the explanation for the whole series of stamps, for the whole class of members of a particular class, for example? And if you skip over to slide 15, Leibniz's cosmological argument based upon this principle of sufficient reason. We've already done this with Aquinas. We look at the individual entities that are contingent, that therefore cry out for an explanation. Cells cry out for an explanation. Platypuses, or platypi, that's a platypus. If any creature cries out for an explanation, it's that one. What the hell is a platypus? I'm quite serious about that. It's unclear whether it's a duck, whether it's a beaver, a fish, a seal. I'm told it lactates somehow, and it spits out poison from its duck bill. It's amphibious. I think that means it can go on water or land. It's truly an amazing thing, but it cries out for an explanation. Why and how did such a thing come to pass? Anyway, and then there's, next to the platypus, Lola. I brought her about, in part. And then there's Milo next to her with, I'm not sure what he's doing there. And then there are mountains, and then there are planets. I'm obviously skipping some things here. But each of these things, as we rehearsed before, are contingent. There's our galaxy. And then if you skip to the next slide, you see, well, you don't see the universe because you can't really get an image of the whole unless we are outside of the universe. This, of course, is not possible. We don't have any God's eye view of the universe. But in any case, all of this requires an explanation. You might say, going back to the previous slide, that the platypus could be explained by these things prior to it. And those can be causally explained by things prior to that. You'll eventually get back to the Big Bang. And of course the question, what caused the Big Bang? That's where we are, and that calls out for an explanation. Slide 17, you see this chicken-egg problem, which is really, I don't mean to trivialize this, but there's an element of problematic explanations here that are analogous to the chicken and egg nonsense that you're familiar with. You can think of it in terms of a chicken and egg regress, infinite regress. The egg brought a chicken about, but the chicken, of course, had to bring that egg about. There's a circular version, it's viciously circular, or it's infinitely regressive. In either case, we have a logical problem. How do we avoid a circular explanation where the egg brought about the chicken and the chicken brought about the egg? How do we avoid an infinite regress situation where you've got an infinite regress of eggs and chickens and no starting point, right? The variation on this, of course, is this railway car analogy. On slide 18, you've got a number of railway cars. Look at the first one there. It's moving. What caused it to move? The one right behind it. What caused that one to move? The one behind it. And so on, ad infinitum. That's why this thing is moving, because each of the railway cars themselves are pushing the one before it. We tend to not like such explanations. This is why, sort of visually, we get a problem of infinite regress, something we'll return to with the Kalam thought experiment, the Kalam cosmological argument. If there isn't a first mover of this track, of these railway cars, then the motion of any of them is left unexplained. The cosmological argument relies upon an explanation for the whole series, in this case, of moving railway cars. No one is satisfied by saying, it's an infinite number of railway cars. That's why these particular ones that you currently perceive are moving. We find that repugnant, we find that absurd, we are displeased with that. And so we cry out for a first cause, an uncaused cause. Of course, the analogy here is the engine car is God, I guess, in this analogy. The next slide, I have a link to the debate between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston. I encourage you to listen to it. This is from a BBC audio recording in 1948, and this is how this was a very common thing where philosophers would debate each other, and they're so cordial. In fact, maybe too nice to each other. They both sound identical. They sound exactly alike. Very high-pitched voices. Really hard to tell one from the other. So pay attention when they're first introduced and keep track of who's saying what. Frederick Copleston is a Jesuit priest. He's written a lot on philosophy and theology. He has a whole history of philosophy series that he wrote up, if you're interested. He's going to argue in favor of a Thomistic, Aquinas, cosmological argument. And in fact, they're going to go back and forth on who's being guilty of a fallacy with respect to this argument. You'll hear Russell say, look, I've explained everything to the extent that I've explained each proximate cause. I explain the cause immediately preceding this effect, and then I explain the cause immediately preceding that cause. If I'm able to do that among all the individual contingent things, then I have either explained the entirety, and I don't need to go further, and there he's borrowing from the Scottish philosopher David Hume. I don't need to go any further than that, or I should simply commit to the fact that the universe is itself a brute fact. It just is. And this we'll see he's relying on, although I don't think he says it, a version of Occam's razor. The simpler hypothesis is to be preferred. The universe itself exists, we have no question of that. But invoking a God is another metaphysical kind of thing that cries out itself for an explanation. And Russell tells us, why not just allow that the universe is a brute fact? Because we end up doing that anyway. Yeah, we're violating the principle of sufficient reason by incorporating a brute, unexplained fact. It's unclear how we avoid that problem when we introduce God. We can just simply state God by definition as a self-sustaining, self-explanatory entity. But this is not satisfactory to someone like Bertrand Russell. Now, on the other hand, Frederick Copleston will return and say, wait a minute, it seems you're guilty of an error in reasoning yourself when you say that we have explained the whole insofar as we have adequately explained the parts. The fallacy in question here, if you look to the next slide, there's a lot of words on it, sorry, it's the second to last slide here, is the fallacy of composition. So these are problems with the cosmological argument. Some of them are brought out by or in that debate between Russell and Copleston. So the first is Occam's razor, and it's a question in this case. Is it a problem? Well, we'll see. Is a Russellian, Bertrand Russell, universe alone as a brute fact? Wouldn't that be simpler than a universe that also has a divine being involved, causally responsible for it? I think it's fruitful to look at this as a kind of cosmological mind-body problem. Historically and contemporary philosophy of mind right now is dealing with the issue of how can a mind, which is incorporeal, and here the mind is analogous to God, which is incorporeal, lacking body, have any kind of causal powers with respect to physical stuff. The same problem, how does mind interact with body, can be expanded to how does a God mind interact with the physical universe. And we can explain causally all sorts of things in the physical universe. Russell says, no need to invoke this extra stuff. Do not, as William of Ockham famously put it, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Russell thinks it's unnecessary to invoke God. Of course, Copleston and Aquinas, and we'll see with William Lane Craig later, argue the opposite, that it is indeed necessary. Russell asked, why can't the world itself be uncaused? Why couldn't it be necessary? Why couldn't it be that which stops the regress? This we'll spend more time on with the Kalam argument, but both philosophers, Russell and Copleston, accuse each other of the fallacy of composition, right? They both say it that way. It's a fallacy of composition. That's exactly how they talk, by the way. They sound exactly like I just said. And they debate whether or not, the fallacy of composition, I should tell you, is where I say what is true of the parts is necessarily true of the whole. Sometimes that's accurate, but not by definition. And so if I say I've explained the parts, therefore I've explained the whole, Copleston will say, no, you can't go that way. You can't go from part to whole in that way. You have to have an explanation outside of the parts. To which Russell replies, well, wait a minute, you seem to be guilty of this fallacy. You seem to be saying that because something is true of each of the members, let's say, of a class, it must be true of the whole. Well, that's like saying, I think this is his example, everyone in our class has a mother. Every individual member of the class has a mother. Therefore, the class as a whole, which is comprised of those members, has a mother. The analogy there is every individual contingent being in the universe has a cause. Therefore, the whole universe has a cause. Russell wants to say that no, just like the class doesn't have to have a mother just because the parts of the members of the class have mothers, so likewise the universe itself doesn't have a cause. So why can't the world itself be uncaused? Third one, an infinite chain of contingent beings. I'm going to save that for the Kalam argument. We'll talk about numbers and why numbers as an example of an infinite series is insufficient as a counterexample to those who think that, things can be infinitely extending backward in time. And then what if the principle of sufficient reason is false? Number 4. The last slide I'll say more about it. Is the principle of sufficient reason the same as the causal principle? Every effect has a cause. Put in other words, Are reasons always the same as causes? It seems to me Leibniz and Aquinas and others conflate those terms. And from some of you who remember from the intro class, I think I made this distinction, and maybe I didn't in your section, between reasons and causes. I'll hash that out in a moment. And then 5, even if principle of sufficient reason is true, and it can't be discounted, wouldn't it render God as a brute or crude or unexplained fact? Again, I'm going to return to that with the Kalam argument, say more about it. And 6, I'll return to when we get to the problem of evil. How good is the design? That's Aquinas' fifth way. Is it the kind of universe that one would expect an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being to have made? And related to 6, why must this first cause, this uncaused cause, be a God or God? As Hume puts it, why not assume this cause was a multitude of beings? Or, as Russell concludes, why assume there has to be a cause at all? The last thing I want to say, and has to do with causes and reasons, that problem raised in number 4 on slide 20. What if the principle of sufficient reason is false? What if it's just not the case that everything happens for a reason? Are there no accidents? And I'll end with an anecdote. So this will get me right at an hour. I didn't anticipate going this long. Were we in class taking questions, I'm sure I wouldn't have gotten past slide 6 because you all ask excellent questions. So I hope I'm giving enough material here that I address questions you might have had. And of course, any questions you do have, post them in the first module, the Q&A, so that don't email me, because I want to be able to respond to your questions so that others can see my responses and I don't need to multiply them. In any case, let's end with an anecdote. Some of you are familiar with this story. In fact, it's referenced on slide 21 there. Some years ago, Milo was about 4, and he was sprinting around the house, my son Milo, and I didn't see him, and I slammed right into him, or he into me, and he fell down really hard, really fast, and he fell down in the way that is analogous to Peter Griffin falling down in Family Guy. You know how they speed up the rate of his fall for amusing effect? And I laughed because this was amusing to me. And he was fine. He was crying, but he was all right. But I was laughing because it reminded me of Peter Griffin falling down. And he cried and said, "Why did you do that?" And I said, "It was an accident." And then he said, "But why did you do it?" Even after I told him it was an accident, right? And I realized, well, this is an opportunity to explain the difference between reasons and causes, between accidents, involuntary actions, and that which is done voluntarily, that done on purpose, done with a reason. Now, there may be ways of conflating causes and reasons, again, that this potential counterexample doesn't address, but consider this. If everything happens for a reason, that means there is a reason for everything happening. Well, does that preclude then the possibility of there being actual accidents? An accident, a true accident, as I put it in the slides there, it's a state of affairs in which there was a cause, because every effect has a cause. Your falling down, Milo, was caused by, in part, you running and me running into you. But if it was truly an accident, there was no reason for it having happened. I can give a purely causal, physical, scientific explanation, for example, of hurricanes, of earthquakes, and even coronaviruses. And yes, we will get that explanation very soon. It seems to be a very different kind of question, however, to ask what is the reason for these things? Why do hurricanes, earthquakes, and coronaviruses happen? That why is not the same as how. Science can give us the how. Science can tell us that plate tectonics plays a role in earthquakes forming in an ocean that causes a great tidal wave, which causes a tsunami, which causes the death and destruction of cities, hundreds of thousands of people dying. Purely causal explanation for that. To ask what's the reason for it seems to be a totally different kind of question. And it seems at least logically possible, that one can say consistently, everything happens for a cause, or everything that happens was in some way caused. But to say that there was a reason for it might be potentially problematic, and we will see why that is in more detail. You kind of already get a sense of that now when we look at the problem of evil, the problem of suffering. All right, this concludes this lecture on Aquinas and Leibniz. Take care.